Hi, Dan Alasso here with History for Today. I've been asked recently to show what my process for turning some of my reading notes into permanent notes is. And so I thought I would do that today, looking specifically at Niklas Luhmann's 1981 article, Kommunikation mit Zettelkasten, which I have talked about in the past, but now I'm ready to write some permanent notes on. So this article is one of Luhmann's most complete statements about his Zettelkasten system, and in it Luhmann said that the slipbox was a communication partner, which he implied had some of the attributes of a separate person. The foundation of this idea seems to be that it's useful, or at least it's useful to some researchers and authors, to discuss a project with a knowledgeable peer who may have slightly different interests and who may ask questions that open lines of inquiry that may not be on the author or the researcher's mind or completely in focus. The slipbox is not, of course, a complete replacement for a thoughtful interlocutor who can inject information into the conversation that you don't know, of course. But it can connect the researcher with her or with his past selves, the information that those past selves were interacting with, and the trains of thought that they were producing. And by doing this, the slipbox can surprise us, or at least Luhmann testified that it had surprised him. I think this is a really interesting idea if you pursue it. The idea that our prior selves are different people. We have, I think, an illusion of continuous personal identity. But of course, psychology and philosophy have some things to say about that, which I will leave to another time. My point at this moment is that we can learn some things from the other people who we were, just as we can learn some things from actual other people. And to the extent that it's a mental map drawn by those previous selves, the slipbox can put us in touch with those others. Luhmann says that one of the most basic presuppositions of communication is that partners can mutually surprise each other. Of course, this is a one-way process when we're dealing with a card file, but the point is still relevant. It does seem to be the major value add of this system, that it leads to unanticipated insights. I think the biggest takeaway for me from this article is Luhmann's statement in the third paragraph, that it is impossible to think without writing. He actually seems to realize that this is a reach. So he immediately qualifies the statement and says, at least it is impossible in any sophisticated or anschlussfähig fashion. The German word anschlussfähig can be translated as connectable, but nowadays readers tend to say networked, since that, of course, is what the bidirectional links of the slipbox basically lead to. And so far, this is the idea from this article that I have turned into a permanent note. And the way I did that was by basically going with that idea that thinking equals writing, and saying about it what I have basically just told you. And I imagine that over time, that is going to connect to a lot of the work that I'm going to be doing in the next year or so, building a course to teach my students reading skills, research skills, note-taking, and writing. So we'll see how that network actually grows. Luhmann's definition of information includes a statement that it originates only in systems which possess a comparative schema. Accepting that for the sake of argument, it seems like different people or different versions of ourselves would make different comparisons based on their varied interests, asking different questions, following different trails of connectivity. These might be subsets of this larger comparison idea that might be easier to focus on in this context. I think it's pretty clear how that leads to Luhmann rejecting what he calls systematic ordering in accordance with topics and subtopics in favor of the numbering scheme that he describes as a firm fixed place. For my purposes, this probably includes avoiding using the date and time format for the actual Zettelkasten numbering, since there's probably some information present in when I think of things and in what order. And that data can be captured within the card, but it probably shouldn't be the top line numbering scheme for that same reason, that it imposes an order that might not be helpful to me. The key benefit of having these discrete cards in the box relating to basic ideas is that then I'm free to link them in any way that makes sense to me. Luhmann calls this process arbitrary internal branching and says that it leads to what he calls internal growth. He talks about flexible Verweisungsmöglichkeiten, possibilities of reference or referral or linking. And he urges the reader to be sure to capture the connections radially and also to be very careful to record the backlinks as you're finding them. And this is how the system gains its power to surprise us, I think, because these are the links that we will tend to forget between these pieces of information that will benefit from rediscovering in other contexts. Context seems to be key in this whole process and seems to be one of the things that we lose sight of if we don't leave these traces in the system. In the middle of the article, Luhmann once again says that the slip box gets its own life, independent of the author. How far one wants to follow this idea, I suppose, depends to an extent on how one defines the mind, or at least the conscious mind, perhaps as a network of collected memories. If this is the case, that that's the way the mind works, then it might be correct to think of the slip box more as a second brain, to use the terminology that's become popular in PKM circles. A second brain that we can use to think differently from how we're thinking right now. The box itself, of course, isn't an independent brain. It doesn't have its own will. So as much information as it contains and as many connections, it's not animated and it won't make those connections for us until we use it. Maybe I'll feel differently if I have an experience like Luhmann seems to have had, where the slip box tells me something that is so unexpected that it seems like somebody else is talking. But until then, I'm going to imagine the slip box as a tool for my own thinking rather than as an independent thinking unit. The concept that I do buy into and what seems extremely valuable to me is the idea that I will be able to see complexes of ideas and basically hubs of network traffic that will be clues to me, that will allow me to observe my own interests and see how they develop and see how they change over time. Luhmann talks about incidental ideas that gradually expand and are continually enriched with not only new connections, but with new adjacent information and ideas, until, in his words, they dominate the system. I've been focused lately on looking at and counting the connections because I think that they will tell me a lot. Actually, now I'm thinking that the quality of the connected information is probably very relevant too. But it's certainly true, I think, that a lack of connections should be taken as a sign of weakness. Along these lines, in the long run, it's probably also better for me to avoid connecting notes via tags. I was playing around with that a couple of months ago, and it did have some value in helping me see how things that I were working on were connected. But I imagine that in the longer run, this would tend to short-circuit the process of truly seeing how these ideas and data actually relate to each other. It's another instance, really, of top-down imposition of order that probably hampers the organic emergence of self-ordering in the system. Luhmann seems to believe that one of the slip box's really unique values is its ability to, in his words, look for formulations of problems that relate heterogeneous things with each other. The slipbox memory, in a sense, utilizes this network and actually also takes advantage of the network effect, returning much more useful information than simply returning to my library shelves and opening some books and rereading the highlighted and noted sections and then trying to reproduce the state of mind and the understanding that I had when I first made them would have, as well as recalling the questions that might have been driving me at the time. The slipbox gives me immediate access to the whole elaborate sort of conspiracy theorist map on the wall of this information that I might have made at the time, complete with all of the little yarn connections from one thing to another. Actually, I wish I had some of this available to me regarding prior research that I've done. I did a lot of work on Victorian London when I was researching a possible biography or a historical novel about the life of Charles Bradlaugh. I still technically have all of that information, but in order to make it useful, I would have to reproduce the structure of my understanding of London by rereading all of those sources. It would be much better if I had a model of that knowledge structure that I could sort of return to and walk around in to regain my bearings. And actually, I'm going to try really hard this time to build a structure as I work on my current research project so that I won't lose my work again. Luhmann concludes by talking about the role of accidents or serendipity in scholarship and actually also in life. The slip box, he said, provides combinatorial possibilities which were never planned and which can act in a more or less evolutionary way, producing accidents with sufficiently enhanced probabilities for selection, he says. As I was reading this, I was reminded of Taleb's idea of anti-fragility, how it's about benefiting from both surprises and from the passage of time. Luhmann concludes by saying that it is not methodologically meaningful to isolate origin and value, or apparent order and apparent randomness, from each other. What we should be concentrating on, I think he implies, when he returns at the end to the claim that this is an empirical investigation, is the result. And so that's what I will be working on in my own slipbox and in my digital versions of it. And I'll continue to report on how that's going as I build it. So I hope people have found this a little bit interesting. Thank you very much for listening. I'll see you again next time.